Good afternoon, everyone, and Happy New Year. My name is Sean Sorby. I'm the Director of Veterans Outreach for the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. I'm honored to join you here today for today's discussion on the future of national security, the role of diplomacy and development, and the impact on American families. We're very pleased to have nearly 200 veterans from all across the country participating in this exclusive conversation with Congressman Seth Moulton. We'll formally introduce him in a minute. We've got a lot of old friends I know that are on this call, but there's definitely a lot of folks who are new to USGLC too. So I just want to take a second for those of you new to our organization to give you a little bit of background as to who we are. So USGLC, we are a diverse network of over 500 American businesses and humanitarian organizations, alongside our network of business, faith, and military community leaders spanning from coast to coast and throughout the country. We're particularly proud of our growing voice among the military community, which you are all a critical part of. We have a National Security Council that's chaired by Admiral James Stavridis and General Tony Zinni, and comprised of over 200 generals and flag officers. And then our Veterans for Smart Power initiative is basically everybody else. It's made up of over 30,000 veterans from across the country, from every branch of service, officer, enlisted, those who serve 4 years to 40. And these folks are committed to strengthening our non-military tools. So as to what USGLC does exactly, we bring this diverse cross-section of America together in a firm belief in America's global leadership, and that American aid, strategic investments in diplomacy and development are essential to protecting our national security, advancing our economic interests, and projecting the best of American values around the world, and that our engagement overseas matters to the American family here at home. In DC, we advocate for a small piece of the federal budget known as the International Affairs budget. This supports our diplomats and our embassies and our development programs and has a huge return on investment. For just 1% of the budget, we can support efforts to battle the root causes of violent extremism and instability in other countries, respond to humanitarian disasters, and tackle pandemics like COVID-19, and prevent future outbreaks through strengthening global health. Around the country, we bring together our unique coalition to give voice to these issues around the country, urging members of Congress to support and protect the International Affairs budget. We know that the US can't do this alone. We need to act as a global leader by working with our friends and allies around the world to solve global problems before they reach our shores. So we're going to talk about some really good policy ideas here today. And I want all of you to walk away today feeling not just that you had a good understanding of what our elected representatives need to do to maintain strong American leadership, but also a good understanding of your role as veterans in communicating to Congress the value that development and diplomacy brings to our national security and what it brings to achieving our foreign policy objectives. To that end, after the main event with Congressman Moulton, stay on the call for a special opportunity to easily send a message to some key elected leaders. We've drafted a thank you letter to let the co-chairs of the task force know that we appreciate their leadership, and we need everyone on this call to sign their name. So at this point, I'm going to invite my friend, longtime veteran for Smart Power, Barcott, to deliver a few brief remarks. And he's going to show you a video and introduce Congressman Moulton. And I know those two are great friends. So Ry, take it away.
Thanks so much, Sean, and thanks to everybody on this call for participating in the USGLC network in the United States. It is really important. I've been thrilled to be part of USGLC myself. I live in North Carolina and have been part of the advisory council here in North Carolina for over 15 years. Part of the reason why the mission matters is that, smart, soft power, blending soft power with hard power doesn't have a natural constituency necessarily in DC. And so USGLC is it, and you guys are the grassroots tentacles. So thank you for that. It's my pleasure to introduce in a moment Congressman Seth Moulton. We're going to start with a video of the USGLC's awardee last year, the Four Country Caucus. I am thrilled at the progress of the Four Country Caucus. My organization, With Honor, is a organization founded by veterans to help reduce polarization in Congress by supporting veterans who take a pledge to serve with integrity, civility, and courage, including the courage to meet routinely as part of the Four Country Caucus. It's a bipartisan organization. We invest capital 50-50 across party lines. And without further ado, let me roll a video about the members of the Four Country Caucus, which include Congressman Moulton, who was very integral in setting it up. And last Congress, I am pleased that this caucus was able to pass into law over a dozen items that ranged from the advocating for the pay increase for our active duty military, to the NATO Support Act, to paid parental leave for our federal employees, similar to our active duty military, to the plan to double the expansion of JROTC and a number of other important initiatives to expand national service opportunities. In other words, the Four Country Caucus focuses on things that can get done, that matter for the country, and it's comprised of all veterans, most of whom served after September 11th. So if we could, we'll roll the video.
Two Democrats, two Republicans. These four members of Congress are the leaders of the newly formed Four Country Caucus. All four of them, like the rest of the caucus, have served in the military.
There's 20 of us.
We are about mission. We are about country.
Coming together, using that common ground based on our service.
30 years in the Air Force. Don't remember ever hearing, are you Republican or are you a Democrat?
It is really crucial that we do everything that we can to lead by example.
That's the ethos that we're bringing.
And that is why I believe that we cannot continue to have a go-it-alone attitude when it comes to our foreign policy.
As a Green Beret serving from West Africa to multiple combat tours in Afghanistan, our diplomats are critical.
So I take great responsibility of making sure that my people in my community understand the importance of the State Department.
We must follow the advice of every single military member that came in front of the House Armed Services and said we have to support diplomacy.
We want what is best for our country.
So we stand shoulder to shoulder with USAID, the Peace Corps, and other parts of our foreign assistance apparatus. And certainly as members of Congress, we fully support their agencies to be fully funded.
I think that's an area where we can easily come to the table, have these types of civil conversations, which can lead to discussions about other topics.
In the end, our Congress needs not just 20 of us, we need 435 people figuring out how to work together.
Awesome. Well, that is a perspective that you don't necessarily see a lot in Washington, but it's happening, and it's happening thanks to the leadership of members of Congress like Seth Moulton. Now, Seth and I share a lot in common, starting with our TBS class in the Marines. We attended the basic school together in a company formed a few months after the attacks of September 11th. Seth went on to lead Marines in combat in Iraq, serving a total of 4 tours. We share many friends from our time in active duty, and we share mentors as well, including With Honor's co-founder, David Gergen, who met Seth when he was an undergraduate in physics. Yes, physics major at Harvard. David Gergen helped secure fellowships at the Center for Public Leadership that helped pay for Seth and my graduate school education, which we were fortunate to have at the Kennedy School and Harvard Business School after our active duty time in the Marines. I have many memories as well from those years, a decade or so ago in Boston, when we were thinking about how we'd continue to make a difference in the world after experiencing the exhilarating, as many of you know, at times inimitable highs, as well as heartbreaking lows that comes with service as we've experienced. Seth and I graduated together. His marks were, I'm sure, much higher. We both dipped our toes into the private sector before feeling the tug of service once again. In his case, he ran for Congress in a race against a deep-seated incumbent in his home district of Massachusetts 6th. I didn't follow politics much then and had no idea how much of a Hail Mary that race was when he started. And at one point, the poll showed him over 50 points down. That's a lot. I know now. But he kept at it, damned the torpedoes, pulled together a great team, and pulled it off. He's now entering his fourth term as a congressman. When I started thinking about forming With Honor with David Gergen and another veteran to help reduce polarization in Congress by electing and supporting principled vets across party lines, Seth was naturally one of my first calls. That was about 5 years ago, and we are delighted that the Four Country Caucus of principled veterans, some of whom you saw in that video, now number some 24 veterans in the U.S. House. Last Congress, the inaugural Four Country Caucus received that award at the annual USGLC Gala. Congressman Moulton was there along with his fellow veterans. Those include Congressman Jared Golden, a former Marine sergeant. I mention that because Seth introduced me to Jared during his run for Maine's 2nd congressional seat. As worlds turn this past Tuesday, now Congressman Golden led the first Four Country Caucus meeting for the 117th Congress as its new co-chair. There's a lot more to say about Marine and Congressman Seth Moulton, including his important work now helping to lead our efforts to modernize our military and rebalance our hard and soft power tools as a country for the future. But I've already gone over my allotted time. And so without further ado, Congressman Seth Moulton.
Rye, thank you very much. That's a very kind and overly generous introduction. It's an honor to be here with all of you, but especially a good friend like you, Rye. I do want to take a minute to set the record straight. Yes, I have a degree in physics from Harvard, but I like to point out that for everybody in life who sees my resume and not my transcript, it makes me sound really smart. So high marks were not exactly the hallmark of my time at Harvard, and I have fond memories of when I first met Rye because he lived right down the hall from me at the basic school. And let me tell you, there was one of us who knew what was going on and another who was trying quickly to figure it out. And Rye was definitely the leader there and knew what was going on. Rye has had an extraordinary career, not just in supporting veterans, of which he's done a lot, and he detailed some of that work for all of you, but of just being a true leader in fundamentally serving. And the work that he's done serving communities in Africa is truly legendary. So, Rye, thank you very much. It's great to be here with all of you. I'm going to make just a few opening remarks about the Future of Defense Task Force report and what it means for the future of smart power, because that's it's under that moniker that we find ourselves here together today. I'm going to talk a lot about our future adversaries, the future investments that we need to make in our national security, the challenges that we face in the future. And all of this is ultimately to ensure the future of peace. We brought together a bipartisan group on the House Armed Services Committee for the first time that either the House or the Senate has looked 30 years ahead to the future of our national defense in a very long time. Every single year, we're very proud of voting for a bipartisan defense bill that for the last 50 plus years has always gotten passed, even in very divided times in American government. But because we do it once a year, we sort of necessarily have this 12-month timeline where we're trying to get the troops what they need for the next year. And so we have not spent enough time really stepping back and thinking strategically about where this is all going. So in bringing together 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans from the House Armed Services Committee, several veterans among us to do this, we came to, I think, some remarkable conclusions. And the fact that we all agreed on those remarkable conclusions in this incredibly divisive time in American political history gives all the more credence to how important they are. The first and most important conclusion is that we are losing. We are losing the race to China. We're behind Russia in many respects. Russia still presents the most immediate threat to our national security, between their election meddling to try to undermine our democracy, to the fact that they have a massive nuclear arsenal that's still aimed at us every single day. They present a very immediate threat. But there's no question that the biggest threat we will face over the next 30 plus years is China. And if we continue on our current course, we are absolutely destined to lose that race to China. So if we want to win, we must change, and we must make big changes quickly. What exactly those changes are is, of course, the substance of the report, and that's what I'll get into. But to have a bipartisan group come together and tell Congress and the American people that the stakes are that high, I think is pretty remarkable. Now, when we talk about the conclusions, one of the first we make, for example, is to start a Manhattan Project type effort to ensure that we win the AI race, because artificial intelligence is going to be critical for the future of our national security and, frankly, critical for the future of our economic security as well. There are conclusions like that that probably aren't too surprising for many who've been following these debates in and around Washington lately. But to also have a group of veterans who serve on the House Armed Services Committee come together and say that we need to do a lot of work in diplomacy, that we need to build a new generation of alliances, not just a new generation of weapons systems, that we need a whole new set of treaties to govern how we interact with our allies and our adversaries across the globe, not just new investments in our military services. I think that's quite remarkable as well. And taking a truly whole of government approach to our security that includes organizations like the State Department and USAID, that engages Congress, not just in funding our Department of Defense, but actually ensuring the future of diplomacy in this complicated world, I think is remarkable too. And it's absolutely essential if we're going to win this race. For what it's worth, China is doing this, and they are trying to set the rules of the road. And at the end of the day, whoever wins this competition will set the standard for the global world order. So the stakes here are even higher than our own national security, because they're really about the future of freedom and democracy the world over. We have enjoyed the benefits of the post-World War II era for a long time now, and we sit comfortably at the pinnacle of that world order. But China is challenging that. And it's important to understand and make no bones about the fact that they have a different set of values. They do not embrace freedom and democracy the way that we do. And they are trying to export authoritarianism around the globe. So freedom-loving people everywhere in the world will look to who wins this race, because it will affect their lives as well. So with that, let me turn it over to you, and I look forward to the discussion.
All right, Congressman Moulton, a few thank yous in order. Number one, thanks for being here today. Really appreciate you taking the time. As a fellow Marine, I want to thank you for your service and thank you for your leadership in Congress. I think I speak for a lot of the folks on this call in that regard. And on a personal note, as a Tampa guy, I want to thank you for Tom Brady. I just want to...
Massachusetts is always willing to help the country.
Thank you. So I just want to jump right into it here. And ask you a few questions about the task force report that you co-chaired. So before moving on to some broader topics on U.S. leadership and in the world, and inviting some of our veterans on the call to weigh in as well. So on the report, you noted that a whole of government approach to national security should be led by diplomacy and economic development and cooperation, and supported by development and humanitarian assistance. And strengthened by military to military relationships. And so to that point, drawing on your role on the Armed Services Committee and your experiences overseas, as well as the task force report, why do you see our civilian tools as such important complements to the military in advancing our national security agenda?
Well, I mean, in some ways, this is an easy question to answer as a veteran. And the video that we all saw about the 4-country caucus was pretty easy to put together, because you always see veterans on Capitol Hill on both sides of the aisle talking about how important diplomacy is, because we've seen on the ground what it means when the State Department doesn't show up, or USAID doesn't have the resources that it needs. As General Mattis famously put it, if you cut the State Department, you better buy me more ammunition. So in a way, maybe given the audience, I probably don't need to go into that in any detail because you understand it viscerally if you've experienced it yourselves. But let me talk a little bit about how important this is just as we think about how the world is changing and going into the future. I'll use a couple of examples. NATO has ensured the peace and security of Western Europe and our allies in that critical part of the world for a long time. And NATO has done a remarkable job at preventing Russia from taking over. But today, Russia is attacking us and our NATO allies every single day through the internet. They're trying to undermine the fundamental beliefs in our democratic institutions. They're trying to meddle in our elections. They're trying to influence policy in this sort of gray zone type of conflict. Russia calls it hybrid warfare. And what has NATO done in response? Almost nothing. Because back in 1949, when the charter for NATO was written, we didn't anticipate that Russia would be attacking us through the internet. It's pretty understandable. But the point is that if we want NATO to be effective in the new world, we've got to modernize it. It's not enough just to rely on NATO the way it's always been. Then we start talking about China, because as we've said, and I think you probably all agree, China is the real big threat here looking ahead. And what does NATO do to deter China? And the answer is not much. I mean, you could argue a little bit, but without getting into the weeds, not really much. If you look to the Pacific, we have a lot of key allies, but they don't all get along with each other. South Korea and Japan are great examples. Critical allies for our national security, critical partners in our nation's defense, places where we have a lot of U.S. troops and a lot of U.S. assets, and yet the relationship between those two countries is quite poor. So one of the things we have to look at is what does a framework like NATO look like for the Pacific? These are some of the questions that we have to start asking and start asking aggressively if we want to ensure the future of our security, not just the past. So look, I agree with the people who say that we shouldn't tear NATO apart. And there's a lot of agreement on that in national security circles. But that's not enough. We need to think about a new generation of alliances. And I'll make one other comment on this. As we pursue artificial intelligence, because that's going to be part of future combat, whether we like it or not, because China and the United States have very different value sets. And one of the ways that translates is that China is less concerned about collateral damage. They're less concerned about civilian casualties than we are. That gives them a sort of inherent advantage when it comes to enabling our AI weapons, right? Because they're going to be quite happy to give a lot of autonomy to weapon systems and not require a moral actor, a human, to intervene and decide whether or not to pull the trigger. That's why we need to be winning this race so that we can set the rules of the road. So we need to think about a new generation of alliances to contain this next generation of threats. We also need to think about new treaties to supplant long-standing agreements like the Geneva Accords to govern the future of warfare.
Thanks so much. And I'm glad you brought up China. I just want to get you to elaborate on this just a little bit. The report says, as you alluded to, that China will predominantly be in the non-military and information arena in terms of our competition. We recently did an event with former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates. He argued much of the same and warned that we're falling behind China, like you said, when it comes to investing in our civilian tools. And so what for you do you see as the cost of ceding ground to China and others, especially in developing countries where China is active? And how can we better leverage our strategic advantages in this regard, in this competition, such as our network of allies, like you said, in the Indo-Pacific, to advance U.S. interests at home and abroad?
So let me answer this question in both sort of taking a very broad view and then talking specifically about some of our allies in places like Africa. I spent some time in East Africa towards the beginning of last year. First of all, when you think broadly, China has this concept this phrase that kind of underlies the concept, but they say their goal is to win wars without fighting them. And if you think about it, that's really our goal too, right? We won the Cold War without ever having to really fight it. Now we can get into the semantics, because there are a lot of Americans who absolutely put their lives on the line. Some even lost their lives in the course of winning the Cold War. But we never had some major conflict. We certainly never had a nuclear exchange, and thank God for that. That, of course, is our goal going forward as well. But while China is thinking about how to win wars without fighting them, and often that means existing in this so-called gray zone below, but maybe just below outright military conflict. What has America been doing for the last 20 years? Well, sadly, ironically, we've been fighting a lot of wars without winning them. So we've been doing exactly the opposite of what we need to do. And while China has been sitting comfortably watching us get bogged down in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, they have spent their time and resources on modernizing and thinking about the future of warfare and how they can win wars without fighting, how they can succeed in this sort of gray zone of conflict. And one way that they intend to do that is just through influence of their investments, through their diplomatic influence. And you see that playing out on the ground in East Africa every single day. China is making Marshall Plan scale investments. And I like to use that term, not just to emphasize how big these investments, these foreign investments are that China is making, but because they're kind of taking our playbook. It's not like a new idea. The Marshall Plan in Europe, very difficult to get through Congress at the time, by the way, very controversial when it was first proposed, was an overwhelming success. And we're so grateful that Congress found the courage to pass in a bipartisan way this massive investment overseas, because it has done more for our national security over the last 70 years than we could possibly imagine. Well, China is taking a page from our playbook, and through their Belt and Road Initiative, they are investing in countries like East Africa, countries like Kenya, and we went to Djibouti, and they're actually really making investments throughout Africa, but countries like those in Eastern Africa are one of the areas of focus for China. So how is it going? Well, a lot of people, especially Americans, like to criticize China's effort because they say, oh, well, they're just saddling countries like Kenya with a tremendous amount of debt. That may be true, but if you really think about it, at the end of the day, that just means that Kenya owes more to China. So they might not like the deal. They might not be as happy with China as, say, West Germany was with America, but it's still solidifying that connection to the Chinese regime. And what is America doing? We're actually pulling out of East Africa. We're reducing our troop presence there. This was accelerated under the Trump administration. And as a result, our traditional allies in East Africa are saying, my gosh, we've been here for you through really tough times. You're not here for us. So the ways that this is playing out on the ground, I think, are pretty frightening. But when you also just look at this strategically, you realize that we have a lot of work to do to catch up to where China is and to be able to compete effectively in this new type of so-called gray zone conflict.
So sticking with China a little bit, we've seen a rise in global authoritarianism in recent years. Freedom House is reporting that 80 countries have seen democratic backsliding during the pandemic. So your report calls for the U.S. to support democracy and human rights overseas to push back against that instability. So how do these investments not only demonstrate our values, but also promote our own national security?
Well, I mean, this is how we have always led in the world, that we have put our values into action when it comes to helping the world, to saving the oppressed, to ensuring the future of freedom and democracy. I mean, think about Kennedy's inaugural address, where he talked about these principles, about how, even how he ended it when he said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And then some people forget the next piece, which was ask not what America can do for you, but what we can do together to ensure the future of peace. And that kind of work is something that has always formed the foundation of our work overseas. We've had a lot of debates about when exactly we should intervene. The Clinton administration came to believe it was a big mistake, that they didn't do more to prevent the genocide in Rwanda. We've had debates on both sides of the aisle about whether it was the right decision to go into countries in the Middle East to ensure the future of democracy. But it was that idea that we should be spreading freedom, spreading democracy, and standing up for people who are fighting against oppressive regimes that's always fundamentally tried to underlie these military activities. Now, we don't always get it right. I think it's important to emphasize that. And there is a lot of criticism about many of our adventures overseas, including the one that I took part in Iraq. But every single day on the ground in Iraq, even in a very controversial war, in a war that many would argue has only made things worse, a lot of Iraqis understood why we were there, and they understood what we stood for as Americans. If we lose that, if we don't uphold our values, both in the everyday interactions that our troops have with our partners and allies, and indeed with our adversaries overseas, and in the way that we talk about America's role in the world writ large, then we're going to lose one of the most important advantages that we always have. You really see this playing out in a place like Vietnam. Think about Vietnam. Vietnam fought a brutal war against America not too long ago. It's, of course, if you go there, it's they don't call it the Vietnam War, they call it the American War. We were the ones who came in and invaded. And so in many ways, they have as much reason as any country in the world to hate us. And yet the Vietnamese absolutely love us. They strongly prefer a partnership with America to a partnership with China. And fundamentally, it just comes down to our values. It's because they see China as this oppressive authoritarian regime that will not afford them the freedom and sovereignty that they want to have as a proud nation. Whereas America comes in and says, we want to be your partner. We want to actually help you move towards greater freedom, greater democracy. And so even though China is a much closer neighbor, and China is prepared at this moment, at least, to make much bigger investments in Vietnam, every time I go there, I hear how much they love America and how they want us to be their partner over China. Of course, they're going to be careful about how they say this, but that's absolutely the message that we get. And it's because of our values. Even speaking to a former enemy, it's because of our values that they want to be on our side. I think it's the single greatest advantage that we have when we look at the competition with China. But we've got to make sure that it endures. We've got to make sure that we live up to that reputation. We've got to make sure that we live up to that wonderful phrase that General Mattis always talked about as a 1st Marine Division commander. No better friend, no worse enemy than the United States Marines. That should be America's motto for our national security. And the more people across the world who not only hear that, but truly deeply believe it, that at the end of the day, America will stand up for our fundamental values. It makes us a lot stronger as a nation.
100%. And, I just want to finish up with one last question about the task force report specifically, which is, there's plenty of findings in here, and as a result, some recommendations that come along with them. So I'm interested to know, we're moving into a new Congress, a new administration. What recommendations from the report do you see or would you like to see most implemented, especially when it comes to strengthening our whole of government approach to national security?
Well, in some ways, you're asking me to pick favorites here, but I've already emphasized a few that I think are critical. We need to dramatically increase our investments in artificial intelligence and also in biotech, because China is clearly in a race with us to win these technological competitions. They will be important for our national security and for our economic security. And on the path we're on right now, we're probably going to lose. So these have huge implications across all parts of our government and our economy. We've got to make sure we're truly committed to winning that race. The next is the piece on diplomacy, how we have to envision a new generation of alliances and a new generation of arms control to govern the use of not just nuclear weapons, but autonomous weapons. That we already saw in Nagorno-Karabakh how devastating these drones can be, for example, when they're sent out without human control. And we've got to make sure we're setting the rules of the road. And then the other thing I would say is that, when Russia put up Sputnik back in the 1950s, the United States Congress responded not by just investing in satellite programs or in missile programs, but by investing in graduate school education. Because the Congress back then understood that investing in this fundamental science was what would ultimately give us the advantage that we needed in national security. I think we've forgotten that because we're not investing as much when you look at the figures as a percentage of our GDP and by other measures in basic scientific research. We're not investing as much in education. And as a result, we're falling behind the rest of the world. So in some ways, there's no better investment that we can make in the future of our national security than by investing in our kids. And we've got to make sure that that's a bipartisan priority going forward.
Okay, we want to bring some other folks in this conversation. Can't just be a bunch of Marines on the screen here. So we've invited several of our participants to ask a question for you. Our first one comes from Chad Maxey down in Florida. Chad?
Hi, thank you, Congressman. Thanks for spending the time with us today, and thanks for your service as a combat veteran and what you're doing with this task force.
Chad, since you're from Florida, are you a Tom Brady fan now?
I'm actually from the southern part of Florida, down here close to Miami. So we're thankful that the Patriots did not win the title again this year, as they have for the past decade plus. So. But as I go forward, I'm an Iraq and Afghanistan Army veteran. I served multiple tours as an infantryman during the siege and the surge, and the reconciliation phases. I know one of the reasons that you're such a big champion on alliances and diplomacy is probably because of the fact that we worked together with allies as a multinational force with Brits, Aussies, Koreans, Georgians, and a host of others, something that actually most Americans forget or don't even know about, quite frankly. They think it's just the American war. But my question is this: I've met a lot of talented State Department and military folks. They get it. They get the overseas thing and why it's important to coordinate. I feel like our bigger challenge is how do we explain it to our own citizens, which is a role that you are quite suited to fill. And as we're still vulnerable to this threat of this global pandemic, why is it so critical that we coordinate with our allies to defeat this dangerous virus, which has killed more Americans than any single combat enemy that we ever faced? And to go back to our war's coin phrase, how do we win the hearts and minds of our own citizens on this issue?
Chad, it's a great question, and thank you very much for your service. And I mean, your basic assessment of how I look at this is absolutely right. I actually work very closely with a lot of our allies in Iraq because I spent a lot of time just south of Baghdad, which just happened to be where many of those allies were operating. And oftentimes the experience reminded me of an old Churchill quote, which is the only thing worse than going to war with a bunch of allies is going to war without them. And that's very true. It's not always easy to work with all of these allies. They didn't always see things the same way that we did, but it would have been far worse to go there without them by our side. And we've always got to remember that going forward. But you also very accurately assess one of the biggest challenges we have in actually implementing this, which is explaining it to our constituents back home. Because it seems like a very easy argument to say, Congressman, why are we spending millions of dollars overseas when there are millions of Americans at risk from this coronavirus? And we clearly haven't done enough to stop it. That type of argument can be played out at any time. It doesn't need to be during a pandemic for that line of reasoning. Why are we investing overseas instead of here at home? To simply seem like it makes sense to a lot of people. But I think this is a place where all of you on this call this afternoon really come in, because what I have found is that the single best messenger for this argument is a combat veteran. It's people who have had to put their lives on the line overseas who have seen the consequences of not investing in diplomacy, who understand viscerally what Jim Mattis always says about how critical it is to invest in the State Department so you don't have to buy more ammunition for our troops. We're the ones who have to get out and sell that message. And so one of the things that Rye and I have both been working on with different organizations, by the way, but organizations that share the same values and really have the same mission, which is to get more service veterans into Congress. I say service veterans, by the way, because I don't believe you have to be a military veteran to truly understand what it means to serve the country. So national service veterans, how do we get more national service veterans into Congress who really understand what public service means, what being a servant leader means for our country? We can more effectively make decisions about war and peace because we've seen the consequences of war. But I think we can also be better advocates for investing in diplomacy and preventing war because we can speak with real credibility on the issue.
Thank you so much. And for folks who are watching here, who are tuned in, I want to encourage you, if you have some questions, to go ahead and post those in the chat. There's already been a few. I can't guarantee that we'll get to all of them, but I want to make sure you have the opportunity. Next, I want to bring up Shabaka Gibson from Michigan. Now, with your answer there just now, Congressman, you may have taken a little bit of the wind out of the sails, but I'm going to give him the opportunity to pose it to you anyway, and maybe you can reiterate a little bit. So Shabaka, take it away.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Congressman, for being here. I'm an Iraq War veteran, Army. And for the record, Tom Brady is not from Michigan, but he did go to Michigan, so we'll take some credit for that win. Here's my question. As a veteran, I've had the opportunity to see both our defense and our civilian tools of engagement firsthand. And alongside your fellow congressmen and the four country caucus, you've helped demonstrate that there's a strong bipartisanship for supporting our military and our civilian toolkit, both overseas and leadership positions around the world. So at a time when politics seems to be divided the way it is more than ever, can you share how we can continue to build bipartisanship in Congress, particularly when it comes to advancing U.S. national security and foreign policy goals?
Shabaka, thank you very much for that question. It's a great question, and it's on the minds of a lot of Americans right now when they look at how divided Washington is. And I'll tell you, it's on the minds of a lot of members of Congress. Let me be very blunt about how this is playing out right now. We all saw what happened when the Capitol was attacked by the president's mob on January 6th. That terrible, seditious act was aided and abetted by members of Congress, colleagues of mine, who voted to fundamentally undermine your will, the will of the American people, by refusing to certify the election results. Compare that to 2016, when we know for a fact, as affirmed by the Trump administration themselves, by Trump administration officials, that there was foreign interference in the election. And yet at the end of the day, we all said the peaceful transition of power is what's most important. And so myself, even though I'm a Democrat and I was not thrilled to see Trump elected, I nonetheless voted to certify the Electoral College count. So we've come to a very dark place, and Congress has a role in helping to aid and abet the violence that we saw on January 6th, at least those members of Congress who voted to fundamentally undermine the will of the American people. And so a lot of us now are trying to figure out, how do we continue to work with colleagues who took that fateful vote, who didn't have the political courage to do the right thing for the country when many of their constituents back home may have said something else. And we're trying to figure that out right now. I actually had a very good conversation on the phone this morning with a friend of mine who serves on the Armed Services Committee, who has a pretty strong record of bipartisanship, and yet nonetheless succumbed to that political pressure and voted essentially in favor of sedition. And we had a very productive conversation this morning about how to move forward from that. We're trying to work on a joint resolution to simply reaffirm that the president and the vice president were duly elected. And we can have debates about how to improve election security or whatnot going forward, whether it's from foreign interference or from fraud at home. But we can all agree that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are the lawfully elected president and vice president of the United States. And I was really encouraged by that call because it would have been easy for my Republican colleague to just retreat into a corner and get defensive, to argue with me, or to just say he's not willing politically to take that risk. But instead he said, I'm going to work with you because this would be good for the country. It would help us move forward as a Congress and a nation if we could simply reaffirm the fundamental values of our democracy. And so that's just a little anecdote from literally this morning about how we're trying to make this play out. There are a lot of people in Congress who are not interested in having those conversations, who represent either the far left or the far right, who just want to retreat into their corners and play politics. But America's always been at our best when we're able to come together. As President Biden likes to say, when we come together, when we're united, there's nothing that we cannot do. And I think all of us know that in the military. My friend, Republican Don Bacon, Air Force veteran, general in the Air Force, he said in that video that we saw at the opening of the hour that no one ever asked him in the Air Force whether he was a Democrat or Republican. And that was my experience in the Marines as well. We were there to do a job. We were there to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. Interestingly, having taken the exact same oath, word for word, that I took when I was sworn in to be a member of Congress. And the more that we can all remember that fundamental principle, that we are here fundamentally to protect and defend the Constitution and the values that are enshrined in that document, then the more we'll be able to work together and the more we'll be able to do.
Excellent. And as we're dwindling down on time here, last but certainly not least, I want to bring up Dr. Angela Demery out of Indiana to quickly to pose her question. And if you could touch on it briefly, Congressman, that'd be fantastic. So, Dr. Demery.
Oh, thank you so much, Sean. Congressman, thank you so much for your comments today. And as the founder of the Midwest Women Veterans Coalition, I've seen how many of our veterans across the country are really eager to get involved on important issues like America's global leadership and serve as advocates within their communities. With the global challenges and needs that are growing rapidly around the world, can you tell us what you foresee for funding for international affairs in the coming years? And what's the best way for veteran leaders to get involved and make our voices heard in support of this development and diplomacy?
Well, it's a great question because I mean, you're singing my tune, right? You're saying that veterans should get involved and be advocates here. I'm a huge believer in that. And you don't have to be a member of Congress or the head of some international organization to be in a position to help change the conversation right at home in our communities. Sometimes these are uncomfortable conversations because there are a lot of people who just buy into that old rhetoric that why should we invest overseas? Why should we invest in these organizations that do work overseas when we're not investing enough right here at home? But all of us, I think, here on this call today know that that's not the right way to look at things. In fact, some of the best investments we can make for the future of American security, national security, economic security, our future prosperity right here at home are overseas, are ensuring that we have strong relationships with our allies, are bringing more people into the global commons, ensuring that our values truly set the standard for the global world order. And so I think it's important to engage in this conversation, even if it just means literally at your coffee shop or in your veterans group, down at the VFW, or in running for local office. I hope that one of the lessons of the past few months, and perhaps of January 6th in particular, is that our democracy is fragile and it requires people to come to stand up and serve. John F. Kennedy's favorite quote was actually written by an arch conservative, Edmund Burke, which said that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Well, we need a lot of good men and good women to stand up to ensure the future of our democracy now, more than ever in my lifetime, for sure. And that's work that all of us can do. It's work that none of you should have to do, in the sense that you've all done more than most Americans will ever do to serve our country and I would say to serve our world. But in some ways, we're best positioned because we understand what service is all about to do more national service going forward, to continue to stand up for our values and to find ways to do so in ways that ultimately unite our country, not further divide it. So that's the challenge that we all have ahead of us. But don't think you have to be standing here in Congress to do that. Every one of us has a role to play.
Dr. Demery and Congressman Moulton, you really teed me up there. Before we wrap up, I just want to remind everybody, really getting to this point, after the call, stick around for a little bit after the conclusion for a brief talk about what's next and what you can do. But long story short, I think USGLC, Veterans for Smart Power, can be the vehicle for a lot of you on the call, everyone on the call, to make their voices heard, share their experiences with our elected leaders and with the public, with our countrymen, frankly. So with that, we've had a great conversation here today. I want to invite you, Congressman, to wrap us up and end on a positive note by asking, what keeps you going in these uncertain times? Normally, we'd be meeting face-to-face in an event like this. Here we are at home. So what gives you hope that we can rise to the challenge of stopping the spread of COVID-19, rebuilding our economy, and provide hope to Americans and the world during an uncertain time?
What gives me hope is every single time I meet our troops and I meet our diplomats who are on the front lines. One of the great privileges of being on the Armed Services Committee is that part of my job is to go overseas and see this work on the ground, to make sure it's going well, to make sure that we're doing everything in Congress that we can to support it. But it's an incredibly inspiring experience every single time, because when you see what young Americans are willing to do for our country, are willing to do to ensure the future of peace in our world, it gives me a lot of hope, even back in a divided place like Washington. So that's what inspires me every single day. I didn't grow up interested in running for Congress. As Rye pointed out, I studied physics, which is about as far from politics as you can get as an undergrad. But when I saw in Iraq the consequences of failed leadership in Washington, I said, I want to be a part of changing this. And what continues to give me hope is the work that I see our troops and our diplomats on the front lines doing every single day.
Congressman Moulton, on behalf of everybody here, on behalf of USGLC, Veterans for Smart Power, I just want to thank you for your time. Rye, thank you to you as well, and everybody who posed a question here today. And just hope you stay safe. I know that you're expecting a new child, and congratulations on that. And just thank you so much for your time and for your leadership, sir. And for everybody else, please stick around just a little bit longer for a chat about what's next.
Thanks, everybody. Hope to see you all soon.